This is the Pepperwood Podcast, a production of Pepperwood, a non-profit conservation organization based at a 3,200-acre nature reserve near Santa Rosa, California, in the heart of the traditional homeland of the Wapo people. At Pepperwood, we aim to inspire conservation through science. And on this show, we talk to scientists, stewards, and environmental educators about what they do and how they do it. We hope to give you a glimpse into the real experiences of folks who devote their lives to taking care of local ecosystems and sharing them with others. Welcome, dear listeners. I'm Julianne, environmental educator and your host for this podcast experience, and we have such a treat for you. Our guest on this episode is one of the most eloquent, intelligent, and passionate scientists I have had the honor to meet, and she is going to take us on a poetic and scientific journey through our California grasslands. Michelle Halbur is Pepperwood's Ecology Research Manager, and I am fortunate to say that Michelle was the first representative of Pepperwood that I spent time with when I first inquired about volunteering here 10 years ago, back when she was the preserve ecologist. Whenever I listen to Michelle describe the plants and animals that inhabit our grasslands and the care with which she studies them, it reminds me of why I fell in love with this place and why I feel so lucky to have become a part of this team. Once you have listened to our conversation, you are going to want to hear more from Michelle, believe me. And a resource that you can check out immediately is her webinar on grasslands titled California's Grasslands, the Forest Beneath Our Feet, which is available on the Pepperwood Foundation YouTube channel. We'll also provide a link to that in the show notes for this episode. In that video, Michelle expands upon many of the ideas that we touch upon in today's conversation, and she provides an incredible set of accompanying visuals, even walking your eyes through how an experienced grassland ecologist looks at an expansive grassland in such a dynamic and fun way. Don't miss it. Additionally, Michelle serves on the boards of both the California Native Grassland Association and the Milo Baker chapter of the California Native Plant Society. Those are two other organizations that provide very important advocacy toward grassland conservation and have many more online resources to dig deeper into grasslands. California Native Plant Society even has a website that will let you know what native grasses and wildflowers are suitable for your own backyard. We'll provide links to both of those organizations in the show notes for this episode. Okay, let's not dally any further. Let's get to it. Please enjoy this discussion that I had with Ecology Research Manager Michelle Halbur in October of 2024. So thank you, Michelle, for sitting down and talking to me about grasslands. It's going to be really fun to hear more about that because we know a little bit about how the research goes in the forests, which is maybe a little more recent. Is it true that I think you've been monitoring the grasslands for even longer? Is that true?
Yes, we started our annual grassland monitoring project in 2011 when I first came to Pepperwood.
So yeah, that's a couple of years before those forest monitoring plots were even being thought of. So that's really neat. And then I like to get down with the cast of characters that you spend time with because I love the belly botanizing, literally being on your belly and botanizing that you get to do in the grasslands is so intimate. So who are the little characters? Who are the little species that you are monitoring out there?
Yeah, so we have so many amazing plants in our grasslands. Most people look out and see, just these rolling hills, and they all kind of look, if it's springtime, they might look a little bit green, maybe with little patches of brown, and in summer, they're fully brown. And so it looks like it's just one plant, right? One grass.
Right, just a continuous grass, right.
But if you actually get down and you press your face closer, right, below your knees. You might need to get a nice cushy pad to kneel on if you're like me and want some comfort. Mm-hmm. And if you dig down in there, what you'll notice is there's layers upon layers of all these different species that are coexisting in this amazing space. We have taller grasses like harding grass, which is actually a perennial exotic grass. And what I mean by that is perennial means this is a species that can live more than 1 year, often many, many years. And it is exotic, meaning it did not originate from California.
Oh, okay.
This was a plant that was introduced as erosion control, actually, after the 1964 Hanley fire. And it's also, unfortunately, invasive, which is a different term we use for plants that tend to move into an area and take over and can kind of reduce biodiversity of an area.
Right.
But it's a very tall grass, so it's one of the ones you walk through, and it can be shoulder height, sometimes over your head, depending on the year. And it, a lot of birds really like this grass. It provides a lot of forage. But unfortunately, it does reduce our biodiversity.
Gotcha. So all right off the bat, we're thinking about species and how they interact with each other.
Sure, yeah. And then if you go a little bit deeper down, maybe in a lower layer, maybe I can call it a sub-canopy of our grasslands. Even though we don't have forest canopy overhead, there are different layers within the grassland itself. And further down, you might get into some of your annual grasses. These are grasses that live their entire life cycle in just 1 year. They germinate as seeds, usually in fall or after initial rainfall occurs. That moisture encourages germination, and these are the green grasses you see coming up this time of year. We're in October, and they often produce that kind of golden hills of California look in summer. They go fully dormant, they die back in summer months, and they drop their seeds that wait as these little embryos and seed coats in the soils, waiting for the next rainfall to perk up and grow again. We also have native perennial bunch grasses. These are some of my favorites. Native perennial bunch grasses are native to California. They're endemic to this area. And they can live, depending on the species, sometimes upwards of 100 or 150 years.
That long?
That long. And these are plants that often have really, really deep roots that go meters deep into the soil, 10 feet or more deep into the soil. And the reason they do that is because they need to survive those really hot, dry summer months. And by having roots that go that deep, they can tap into groundwater throughout those dry months and stay alive.
A very precious commodity at this time of year when it's so dry out there.
Absolutely. And they're in bunches, so they don't create kind of the carpet effect that you see of those exotic annual grasses. Instead, they'll be in these little clusters. And that allows space for other plants and animals to coexist. So you get a lot of diversity of plants within our native perennial bunch grass systems.
Oh, great.
And that includes a lot of your wildflowers.
Oh, yes.
Right? So if you're a good player and you have all these bunch grasses with space in between, you can have things like native clovers, you can have buttercups, poppies are some of our favorites, etc.
Absolutely. All right. So a grassland, when we talk about grasslands, we're not just talking about even grasses, right? So then those flowers, and I think we kind of refer to those as like forbs, right? Any of the plants that are green but not woody. That
Correct.
Sort of idea?
Yeah,
right.
That's a great term. Yeah, we call them forbs, which are a lot of your wildflowers that you see out there. Yes. One thing that people don't really think about, and I like to remind folks, is that grasses are flowers too.
Oh, that's
So
a good point.
they kind of are wildflowers. They just don't have really bright, showy petals. Bright, showy petals on things that we normally think of as wildflowers attract pollinators, right? So it's like these big, showy pieces that pollinators can hone in on and come in and get their nectar reward or their pollen reward and help pollinate that individual. But that takes a lot of, biological energy. And grasses are actually one of our most recently involved lineages of plants. And they, instead of spending all this energy on these bright, showy parts, this expensive, biologically expensive pollen and nectar that they have to protect, and that dependency on pollinators to do their reproductive work for them, grasses have evolved out of that and instead have these non-showy, they're kind of like petals, but they're called different terms. Botanists like to use lots of fancy words. But they're basically flower parts that then just open up and dangle in the wind, and the wind does their pollination for them.
Oh, Oh, so I don't think I knew that grasses were like newcomers, evolutionarily speaking. But it does make sense that they've sort of found a way around this relationship dependence, right? That some of the showy flowers do.
Correct.
Okay, so they tend to be wind pollinated. Yes. That's like a more common way of going about it. That's really cool.
Well, and if you're talking evolution and lineages, humans, through our own evolution, have really relied upon grasses for our existence, especially for food. So rice is a grass, corn is a grass, right?
Wheat, I assume.
Wheat
is grass. So these
barley,
are all highly,
oats.
Sort of. Oh my gosh. So yeah, like major staples of human food.
Correct.
In terms of, at least, some cultures anyway. That's kind of a lot of different cultures that you covered there. Really rely on grasses. All right. Well, that's interesting. And they're newcomers kind of like we are. Like we haven't been around that long, evolutionarily speaking either. So I guess we're all sort of in partnership here. Do you have any favorites in terms of who you monitor, or maybe rare species that you don't get to see very much?
Oh, we have a really nice, delicate, rare plant at Pepperwood called Jepson's leptosiphon. Jepson was a botanist in California.
Oh, yes, of course. Right? The Jepson Guide. How can I forget?
The botanist's Bible of sorts. So Jepson was a botanist, and leptosiphon is the genus. Lepto meaning long, siphon meaning tube.
Quick little interruption here. After our conversation, Michelle double-checked on the word leptosiphon, and she wanted to offer this correction. Lepto is not Greek for long, but instead Greek for thin or slender. Well, it's all Greek to us, and I think you'll find that slender tube works just as well as long tube to support her description of this sweet little plant, which I'll get back to now.
And if you can imagine this little plant, it's very delicate, maybe 1 to 2 inches tall, with kind of a bottle brush of leaves and bracts, which is a fun term to look up another time. And these delicate little, out of these clusters, there's these delicate little pale kind of cream to pinkish flowers that have a very tiny long tube that opens up into a little star. And sometimes they're called false baby stars. But what's amazing is these, with that really long floral tube, the nectar reward is way down, away from where an insect could land or hover in front of the flower. And so you have to imagine, what would be pollinating this flower that has this really long tube.
Right.
And it's likely moths, butterflies.
Oh, with those long tongues that they can stick out.
Yeah, that they can fit all the way through that leptosiphon.
Oh, so these tiny little plants that need, the relatively large insects to kind of hunker down and find them. That's really nice.
Yes. Another one of my favorites is bird's eye gilia, Gilia tricolor, and it has blue pollen. It's just absolutely fantastic to look down at this very, very tiny, maybe half an inch wide flower that has like this purplish rim on the outside, kind of a cream color on the inside. And if you look at the male stamens, they're called, they have this lovely blue pollen.
Ooh,
very exciting.
Fancy. I like it. All right, dressing up for spring there. That sounds
you got to
nice.
get down on your belly to see it.
Okay, that sounds worth it. I'm there. Fantastic. So really, you get to kind of shrink your world down into like little tiny parts of it, as opposed to sometimes when we're looking at trees, we're really backing up and looking at a big picture, but your world shrinks down to these little tiny wonders of the grasslands. That sounds like a lovely experience.
It really is, and it's also something to think about with regards to what you're talking about is spatial scales, right? So grasslands might be vast. You might have these large swaths of grasslands, rolling hills in California, but when you get up close, if you just take a few steps from one place to another, you can be within a completely different plant community within that grassland.
So you really got to pay attention.
You really have to pay attention. And a lot of it has to do with the local environment. How rich are the soils? How poor are the soils? How moist are the soils? What slope or aspect are you on? Whether or not you have that harding grass in your way and you're trying to, outcompete this really hardy plant. All of those components can lead to a very dynamic and diverse mosaic of species and communities out there. So even though it looks like one, backdrop of green, there's a lot going on at those smaller scales.
Right, and you've already described it a little bit as like the tallest of grasses, which are maybe shoulder height for us, are sort of like the canopy of a mini forest.
Yeah,
right? So if I think about 2 steps if I were a giant that were as tall as a tree, 2 steps would take me to a very different part of the forest in the same way. So, wow.
Nice.
What a fun little mental image to play around with next time I'm walking around in some grass. Great. When does the monitoring for grasslands take place? Is it year round?
Actually, at Pepperwood, we like to go out into our grasslands. We basically visit the same places year after year in the first part of May. And we chose that because that's a time of year where we're really close to the peak of productivity and diversity. So we have, the most number of plants, most number of species kind of flowering or doing their thing at the same time, so we can identify them. But also we have almost peak productivity, so we can get a sense of how much biomass or how much plant material is produced year after year above ground.
Gotcha. That seems like a pretty magic time in, late spring, early summer, because we've got a lot of solar energy coming in, right? And we also have the warmth, which is allowing all of the species to be a little more productive, a little more active. But we also, unlike in fall, we have all the moisture that's left over from the winter rains, hopefully. So that seems like a big crossroads of things in terms of if I were a plant, I would care very much about that time.
Yes.
Seems very important. Okay.
Well, and by we actually picked the calendar dates of May 1st through 15th every year. Because just logistically, it's a lot easier to calendar. I know where I am every May 1st through 15th, but also it's not too late in the season if it's a really dry year, like some of our extreme droughts we've experiencing, right? We can still identify species. There's still stuff there. We know what it is. And it's also not too early in these kind of cooler, wet years that we have. So in California, year to year, it's highly variable, which is exciting because that creates, all these different assemblages or groupings of species. They might, in really dry years, we might have species overlapping, like early bloomers and late bloomers all blooming at the same time.
Just a big hurry.
It's a compressed, and we got to get our reproduction done before we die down, right? We're annuals, we're going to die. And then otherwise, in the wet years, it might spread out. So it's quite exciting.
Okay. But logistically, that also might mean if you only have the same 15 days every year, and if anything goes wrong, that must really get in the way of the process. Is that right?
Uh-oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay. So we'll keep our fingers crossed as next time we come around to May for you, that everything is going smoothly.
Well, I decided to have both my children right around that time. So, I missed a couple field seasons.
That does happen. Well, and fortunately, you have a great team who can back you up, I hope.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. So when you're doing this work year after year, and you've been doing it for now, okay, you said 2011, 2024, so we're almost getting up to a decade and a half worth of data. Does that sound right?
So yeah, we have 14 seasons.
14 full seasons documented in the computer. How are you hoping that having this information might change the kind of work that gets done here at Pepperwood or anywhere?
Yeah, so when we're out there, what we're looking at is, at Pepperwood, we're an actively managed or stewarded landscape. And what I mean by that is we are taking care of our grasslands, including ecological processes that historically were here to maintain grasslands as grasslands. So grasslands are a vegetation community that requires some form of disturbance to keep it a grassland. If we remove that disturbance, what often happens is you get shrubs moving in and then forests moving in that in their place. And that's a process that's called succession. By having some form of disturbance, whether it's wildfire, prescribed fire, maybe it was historically elk moving through the range, doing their grazing and their hoof punch as they pass through in these larger herds, all of that activity would reset that successional clock back to a grassland, maintaining that diversity of herbaceous species. And so instead of having these historical processes like elk, we no longer have elk, unfortunately, right? But we need that disturbance to keep our grasslands. We bring on cattle, and we have cattle that graze here regularly. And so our monitoring is able to basically assess, given all the stewardship we're doing, how are our grasslands doing from year after year? Are we reaching the objectives that we set as responsible land stewards? One of which is, one of our main goals is to support and hopefully enhance native biodiversity.
Right.
So going out there and seeing who is there, how much is there, how is that changing year after year, given all of these wonderful activities we're doing? Are we sustaining, are we enhancing our grasslands?
Right. Well, and that must be difficult to decide when you're seeing results, when you're seeing changes, or if you're seeing not changes, whether the stewardship that we're doing and the choices we're making in terms of management are the drivers of those changes or not changes, or if it's something beyond our control.
Yeah, or even an interaction of something not in our control, like climate change and grazing. Are we going to graze the same way we're grazing now if it is going to be hotter and drier in the future with maybe different species moving through?
Right.
And so this, what we call the adaptive management cycle, is really important. It's all about setting objectives, going out there and doing the actions that you hope will give you those outcomes you're looking for, monitoring the impact and the outcomes, coming back, into the office, crunching the data like the scientist I am, and sharing those results with our team to really look and have conversations about what's going on. For instance, let's say bare ground starts increasing. Well, maybe there's too much bare ground. What does that mean, too much? If you have too much bare ground, maybe there's a risk of erosion, right? You're going to lose your topsoil. You're going to have gullies forming in your grasslands. Maybe you're losing diversity of species that are creating these blank spaces, or maybe you're overgrazing. Right. So we can go to these places, we can look at them, have conversations, and fine tune how we're impacting and kind of nudging the trajectory of our land.
So in some ways, your results aren't just impacting like future work at Pepperwood. In some ways, your results are at least coming into the conversation of what's happening currently at Pepperwood. So it's a very quick turnaround because you're working so carefully together.
Yes, it's an annual cycle, really. And we gauge, each year, ideally, each year, how we're doing, what we can do better, and how we can fine tune moving forward.
That's great.
Yeah.
Fun. Have cattle been a part of this landscape for as long as you've been here?
As long as I have been here, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
And when I first came on staff, one of the things I was most impressed with was that Michael Gologli, our preserve manager, he really wanted to make sure that our intention of keeping grasslands was supporting the historical ecology of this area. Right? So one of the questions was, were these grasslands always grasslands?
Yeah, for how long has that been the case, right?
And if so or not, how do we best steward? Do we want to plant trees instead? Was it once a forest? And then maybe the homesteaders that came out here in the 1850s, where they set up their orchards, their vineyards, they had their grazing sheep and goats. Did that convert forest to grassland? So that was a big question Michael had. And he recruited a local historical ecologist, Arthur Dawson.
Cool.
And a scientist at UC Berkeley, Rand Evett, to do some various analyses and assessments. And Arthur Dawson looked at maps from the 1940s to, I think, the early 2000s. And just within that short time span, the difference of our grasslands from 1940s to 2000s was a reduction of about 10%.
Oh, so if anything, we used to have quite a bit more.
We used to have more, even in a short period of time.
Yeah.
But if you go back further, he also reoccupied the 1800s census locations that took place at Pepperwood. Mm-hmm. And with those historical documents in hand, I hope it was a photocopy, probably. With the photocopy of those documents, he was able to stand in the same location and look out in the same direction and read their descriptive, assessment of the land. And sure enough, most of the places where it describes these rolling hills, with these various grassy ridge tops, speckled with oaks, is exactly what we see today.
Ah.
And then you combine those historical documents with some of Rand Evett's work. He looked at phytoliths in the soils.
Oh, you're going to have to break that down for me. Phytolith.
I love words. Phyto meaning plant, lith meaning rock.
Okay.
So these plants have a really remarkable ability. They're chemists by nature, and they can create these crystalline bodies inside of their tissues called phytoliths that are made out of silica.
Sure.
So, and silica doesn't decompose over time, and so different species will have different shapes, different assemblages of species will have different densities. So, and grasses are particularly rich in silica.
Right.
Right? So Rand is an expert in phytoliths, their structure and composition and densities, and he took lots of soil cores throughout Pepperwood. And the deeper you go in soil, the further back in time you're going. Right. Essentially, you're exploring that history. And what he determined, looking at the phytoliths of Pepperwood, is that our grasslands were predominantly grasslands and have been for a very long time. And in fact, he detected a lot of our native species, like purple needlegrass, our state grass, as well as California fescue and others.
That's so fun.
And also, if you consider indigenous burning, that most likely, probably if not 100%, happened in this region, that fire, the routine fire, at regular intervals, likely also kept these ridge tops as grasslands.
That's so great.
So that all provides evidence and support for us maintaining these disturbances and these natural processes, right, through cattle instead of elk, and through our good fire or prescribed fire instead of wildfire.
Yes. Well, I think one thing we definitely covered with Devin back when we chatted with him was that prescribed fires are a much more pleasant and relaxing experience than any wildfire could ever be. So
absolutely.
We're 100% on board with that. And it's great to hear that we're sort of picking up the stewardship that has been being done here for so many thousands of years after having let it lapse for some time. But we're picking it back up, and we feel really confident that that's going to maintain the ecosystems and hopefully even enhance them.
Absolutely.
Love that. All right. Well, what makes the long-term monitoring that you're doing out there in the grasslands possible? Because I know how hard it is to get out there every year and to get this data. It's so precious once that time passes, especially with this small window. So what do you feel like supports you and your team making that happen?
Oh, there's lots of different elements. I mean, the first that comes to mind is the nice caffeinated beverages we have before we go out and sample every day. Also, the teamwork and camaraderie and the fun that we have is really, and the passion about our landscape and doing, caretaking these places with intention and with an ecological sensitivity, right? That's something that we all bring to the table and we care about. So we're all behind this work. And just the sheer joy of learning every year, right? And one thing I love is that my coworker, Macaulay, when she was first training on our grassland monitoring, she would call me, on cell phones across the preserve and be like, oh, I'm standing in this one place. And I'm like, oh, are you in quadrat 9? Yeah. And I'm like, oh, here's the list of species from my memory because I visited that place time and time again. And you just learn who's there, how they stay there, sometimes for year after year, and sometimes they blink out. As far as actual financial support, it's really important that people recognize that nonprofits like us doing this work are funded through their financial support and their memberships and their donations. And so we're just totally indebted to all of our supporters. We also get some grant funding here and there, but long-term projects, they tend to fizzle out because they're not these like emergencies that need to be taken care of, right? They're not these like glamorous things. You're like, oh, it's just business as usual. But the value of these data sets has yet to be expressed because thank goodness we had this monitoring in place prior to the 2017 Tubbs and the 2019 Kincaid fires, because we now have a pre-wildfire data set and a post-wildfire data set under all these different burns that are happening. And the fact that we've experienced multiple droughts in that time period as well, we're going to learn a lot about the complexities of wildfire, grazing, climate change, you name it, in an age when people more than ever just really want to support the natural resources and beauty that we have in our region.
Yeah, that's on one hand, like lacking a crystal ball, it can be very difficult to tell a potential grant funder, hey, in 5 years, we're going to really need this data. But on the other hand, maybe knowing that like disturbance and change and emergencies and the unexpected is always coming somewhere down the line.
Right.
Hopefully they can start to see like, hey, we're going to need this before data. I don't know what it's before, but some stuff's going to happen in the future. So we're going to need to know what's going on now to be able to make the comparison.
Right. And, we've been just talking about the plants of grasslands, but there's also so many wildlife that require grasslands.
Absolutely.
We have North American badger that move through the preserve, creating burrows and moving on their way. We have a lot of native birds that utilize our space, our grasslands in particular. We have migratory grasshopper sparrows, which are not very common and move through the region. But there's a lot at Pepperwood, and they're ground nesting birds. So they have their nests just vulnerably, like on the ground, where they can be predated upon.
That's a gamble right there.
But our grasses support these animals. Western meadowlarks is another one of my favorite species in grasslands, with their kind of canary yellow, or I should say Western meadowlark yellow chest, and their brilliant songs, and the flocks of them and the sound of their wings as they flap through the grasslands. There is a North American breeding bird survey, and in California, Western meadowlarks have been in decline since 1960. However, at Pepperwood, we monitor our birds in April through June, and Western meadowlarks since 2007 have continually increased at Pepperwood.
So the opposite of the trend we see sort of nationally.
Correct.
That's so good to hear. We are the refuge that they are taking, I hope. Yeah.
Well, and it speaks to they're an indicator of grassland health, and so it really speaks to the careful stewardship and caretaking that we provide for this space.
Well, great. So I know it sounds like we have a very specific protocol for maintaining our understanding of the bird species. We've got that annual breeding bird survey. What other kind of monitoring goes on for the animals in the grasslands?
Oh, yeah. We have a wonderful wildlife picture index project where we have basically a grid of cameras. They're each placed about 1 kilometer apart, 20 cameras at Pepperwood. We also have 20 cameras up north at Modini Preserves, which is run by Audubon Canyon Ranch.
Oh, Sister
of which
Preserve.
you know very well, Julianne.
I spent 5 years working there, loved it there, and I love the relationship between us and them.
Well, we're in a modeled wildlife corridor between us and Modini. And so by having these grids, we can watch how these animals move through this landscape, including all the grasslands in between.
Sure, absolutely. Well, that's wonderful. Okay, so those are two major ways. We have this breeding bird surveys, and then the wildlife cameras, many of which I'm sure end up in grasslands, in our grassland-rich landscape.
Yes, and we also have cover boards, which are basically a square or rectangle of plywood that's plopped on the ground. And some of those cover boards are in grassland communities. And we essentially go out there with interns and volunteers and scientists. We lift these boards and look at what's underneath. And what we're particularly interested in are what we call herpetofauna, reptiles, amphibians, as well as invertebrates, insects, scorpions, and such.
That's great. So even though the forest monitoring plots sort of have their own little world, there's a lot of crossover between the kind of data we're collecting for grasslands as with forests, just maybe in a slightly different sort of annual ritual.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, and if you think about it, the understory of a forest is really just a continuum with the open canopy grasslands.
That's right. There aren't like some solid boundaries around that,
Right?
right?
Yeah. You go from complete open, herbaceous, dominated grasslands or rangelands to maybe a slight shrub to forest edge to under the canopy. And you see a lot of similar species that occur throughout.
Sure. And then, of course, some unique ones that really need the sun or ones that really don't want to have direct sunlight. So you have a little bit of both. Okay.
Yes.
Right.
And so when you're doing forest work, the trees, they're 200 plus years old often, like some of these old oaks that we're dealing with in mixed hardwood forests, right? So they're representing kind of ancient climate in a way. Whereas with like rapid climate change that's occurring, if you really want to detect change and where these communities are going, you look beneath your feet.
Right. The grasslands are the first ones that are going to respond because they're faster growing and faster dying.
Yeah, those herbaceous species underfoot, the shrubs that are germinating, the tree seedlings that are coming up, that's the future forest under your feet.
Right.
So we're documenting all of that underfoot stuff in our forest every year as well as our open grasslands.
Great. Oh, that sounds like a really good time. I'm
Absolutely.
sure it's also very tough and hot, and May can be a warm time of year. So I'm sure you earn the snacks you get at the end of the day there, and use up all of the caffeine that you consumed early on. What is something that you think people just need to know about grasslands?
Grasslands are actually one of the most threatened vegetation communities in California. Okay, we've lost almost 90%, if not more, of our native grasslands. They host, I think the statistic is 90% of endangered and threatened species. Wow. That includes plants and animals. They use grasslands. So they're often the first places that are developed. They're not well understood because they are so complex on short spatial scales or small spatial scales, but also short time scales. And what I mean by that is my favorite grassland is a grassland that has recently burned. Because what happens is with that fire, it wakes up the seed bank that in some cases might have been there sleeping, waiting for 50, 60 years.
And some of those seeds are still viable and ready
They're
to go?
viable, and they wake up, they germinate, and you have these blooms that are absolutely gorgeous. Like after the Tubbs fire, our grasslands woke up. And what that did to me, it woke me up to the fact that if we don't have fire in this equation of stewarding grasslands, we don't fully understand the full potential of that community, of the seed bank that is there. And there's this temporal scale that we really need to be thinking about, not just spatial scale, but temporal, and these periodic events over time that replenish that seed bank, right? That's very, very critical. And we don't know much about that throughout California because we've been suppressing fire for over 150 years.
And grasslands, as you say, they function on a slightly shorter time scale than the forests. So the 200 years might have been really impactful to a species that maybe has much shorter turnover than a 300-year-old oak tree.
Yeah, who knows what species are lying there asleep under your feet, as you're walking through.
Well, that's mysterious. I'm excited. I'm excited to think about that. Well, Michelle, this has been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much. I know what a busy lady you are, so thanks for stopping by and taking some time to talk to us about grasslands.
Oh, this was so much fun. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Michelle is my hero. See, I'll bet you thought I was being over the top with worshipfulness in my introduction at the beginning of the episode, but isn't she an absolute poet? Please share this experience with anyone in your life who you think deserves to fall in love with California's grasslands. Ways to support the podcast and Pepperwood itself include sharing our Facebook and Instagram announcements, which we post for each episode. You can also subscribe to our podcast feed on Spotify or YouTube or wherever you access your podcasts. And you can register to attend one of Pepperwood's community events, classes, workshops, or stewardship workdays and invite someone along with you. We will include a link to our classes and events page in the show notes for this episode to help you access all of that fun. And as part of the education team, you might think I'm biased on the side of the events and classes, but I'd actually like to highlight the stewardship workdays because they are the most direct and tangible way to get to know and support the native bunchgrass communities that Michelle described in our conversation. Our stewardship volunteers are the backbone of our bunchgrass planting program. You can join us in late spring to collect native bunchgrass seeds. You can join us in fall to prepare and sow those seeds in the shade house. Or you can join us in the wet season, strap on your boots, and help plant baby bunchgrass plugs out on the landscape. During the past 2 wet seasons, our volunteer and staff have planted 25,000 native bunchgrass plugs each year. So join us to help those valuable species support our soil health, contribute to carbon sequestration, and provide many other ecological functions. Thank you to all of my fellow staff members at Pepperwood who help support the production of this podcast. And now, snap to attention and prepare your ears for the Nature Sound Guess Who game. At the end of episode 3, the Nature Sound Challenge clip sounded just like this. And we have not received any guesses for that critter as of this recording, so you all might be as puzzled as I would be. The identity of the sound maker in that clip is the western meadowlark. What? Sternella neglecta? The very same grassland-loving songbird that Michelle mentioned in today's conversation? Did I plan this? I promise you I did not. I had already planned for that meadowlark call to be revealed in this episode, and I was so tickled when Michelle highlighted their population dynamics in our chat. I will admit, however, that I purposefully chose a type of call from this bird species because they have several vocalizations that I consider to be slightly less characteristic of this species compared to the one that I know best. You meadowlark lovers out there will probably know what I mean. The western meadowlark song that I listen for every time I'm out on the reserve sounds like this. That's sometimes referred to as their song, whereas the challenge clip is referred to as a call. They have at least one more distinctive call, a forlorn little sound that goes like this. Aww. Any of those vocalizations might come from a western meadowlark, and they are all sourced from the Macaulay Library, which is run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The challenge clip was recorded and contributed to that incredible resource by Randolph Little, the song by John Patterson, and the second sad little call by Bob McGuire. If you are interested in birds and bird calls, definitely check out their associated website, ebird.org, where you can search for species or by region under the Explore tab. They have an incredible database of sounds, images, and additional information about hundreds of bird species. But before you run off to peruse ebird.org for the next 2 hours, listen closely because here comes this week's challenge clip in 3, 2, 1. And again in 3, 2, 1. I wish you much luck and fun in figuring out the mystery noisemaker from that clip. And don't forget to submit your guesses on our Facebook or Instagram episode announcement post or email it in to podcast@pepperwoodpreserve.org. Thanks for listening, folks. And until next time, keep your ears tuned into nature.